In 33 minutes, a stretch of water that carries a fifth of the world's oil went from locked down to wide open again, with 14 Iranian boats gone, 9 coastal bases burning, and 2 US destroyers sailing out almost without a scratch. What actually unfolded inside the Strait of Hormuz that day wasn't just another naval clash. It was a brutal reminder of who really controls the world's most important oil choke point. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow cut of water between Iran and Oman, the only sea passage from the Persian Gulf to the open ocean and a critical artery for global energy. Every day, tankers carry millions of barrels of oil and liquefied natural gas through this channel, feeding the economies of Asia, Europe, and beyond. If that flow stops, there are few backup routes. Most Gulf oil has no practical way around this bottleneck. That is why analysts routinely call the Strait of Hormuz the world's most important oil choke point. When it closes, the global economy chokes with it. 3 weeks before the 33-minute battle, the chain reaction started somewhere far inland. A joint US-Israeli strike hit deep inside Iran, targeting nuclear facilities, command centers, and key military infrastructure in a single synchronized blow. Reports claimed the operation crippled several hardened sites and, according to some accounts, took out figures at the very top of the regime's hierarchy. Iran wasn't just wounded, it was shaken. The system that had built its power for decades suddenly looked exposed, and the generals who survived knew one thing. They needed leverage fast. They couldn't match American air power head-on, and hitting US soil directly would trigger a response they weren't prepared to face. So they reached for something far more strategic than a single retaliatory strike. They went after the world's pressure point, the Strait of Hormuz. Shutting down a lane where more than a fifth of the world's oil exports move every day doesn't just hurt one country, it sends shockwaves from Tokyo to Berlin. Overnight, oil traders started projecting shortages, tanker captains halted transit, and markets braced for a supply shock that no one had seen in years. On March 2nd, the announcement came from Tehran. Iran's Revolutionary Guard declared the Strait of Hormuz closed until further notice. Any vessel attempting passage would be considered hostile. Any ship entering the strait would be targeted. The message was blunt. These waters now belonged to Iran. Within hours, traffic maps and satellite feeds showed the effect. Tankers clustered in the Persian Gulf with nowhere to go, their hulls filled with crude that Japan, India, South Korea, Europe, and the US desperately needed to keep their economies moving. Insurance companies flagged the route as effectively uninsurable. Energy analysts warned that 20% or more of global petroleum flows were suddenly at risk. Prices did what everyone feared. Oil spiked past triple digits, and analysts began sketching out worst-case scenarios, airlines grounding flights, factories slowing production, stock markets sliding as energy costs ripped through every sector. In Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, New Delhi, Tokyo, and Brussels, the question was the same. Would Washington accept this new reality and negotiate with Tehran, or would it break the blockade by force? Behind closed doors, one conclusion kept coming up. If America allowed the Strait of Hormuz to stay closed, every future crisis would be measured against this moment. Out in the Gulf of Oman, far from the cameras and press statements, the answer was already moving at 25 knots. 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, the backbone of the modern U.S. Navy, sat in international waters, hull numbers gray, radars turning, crews on edge. They were built for exactly this kind of nightmare: dense threat environments, incoming missiles, swarm attacks, and the kind of pressure where one wrong decision could cost hundreds of lives. On board, roughly 240 Marines and sailors were about to receive the order that would define their careers, and maybe the next decade of naval strategy. In a secure compartment, the operation was laid out in uncompromising terms. There would be no waiting for negotiations, no convoy of tankers trailing behind as a photo op, and no half measures. The mission was simple and brutal: force the strait open, sail through, break the blockade. If attacked, neutralize whatever Iran threw at them. Strategists in Washington were fully aware of what that meant. If Iran was serious about its threats, 2 US destroyers were about to sail straight into a layered kill zone, with the whole world watching. If they failed, it would be a historic embarrassment. If they succeeded, the message would echo for years. On the bridge of the lead destroyer, the captain stood over the chart table, watching the plotted course run like a knife through a narrow line labeled Hormuz Strait. He had spent his career training for worst-case scenarios, but this was different. This wasn't an exercise against simulated targets or a freedom of navigation patrol that everyone knew would end with stern radio calls and nothing more. This was a direct challenge to a country that had just announced in front of the world that it would attack any ship crossing this line. He keyed the ship's intercom, his voice calm but edged with steel. He told his crew the truth. The strait was closed, the global economy was hanging in the balance, and their orders were to go through anyway. Iran would likely respond, and when it did, they had to be faster, sharper, and more precise than they had ever been in training. On the second destroyer, the message was almost identical, but the delivery was different. That captain was known for never raising his voice, even under fire. He didn't try to hype his sailors or give a movie-style speech. He laid out the situation in plain language. Iran believed that closing the strait gave it leverage over the entire world. They were about to prove that belief wrong. Both ships would go in together, overlapping their weapons coverage, supporting each other's blind spots, and turning the narrow channel into a moving fortress of radar, missiles, guns, and marines ready with small arms if the fight got close. He finished with one line that stuck with the crew. "We're not here to show the flag. We're here to open the door and keep it open." 60 miles to the north, across the water at Bandar Abbas, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Navy had been watching every movement. Their commander, a rear admiral with years of experience, had long believed that the United States' greatest vulnerability in the Gulf wasn't its technology, but its overconfidence. He had studied asymmetric warfare doctrines that turned small, cheap boats into serious threats for billion-dollar warships through speed, surprise, and mass. In his mind, the narrow confines of the Strait of Hormuz weren't a weakness for Iran, they were a weapon. His radar operators watched as the two American destroyers edged closer to the strait's mouth, changing formation, tightening their spacing, and bringing their bows toward the chokepoint. He didn't need a briefing to understand what that meant. They weren't bluffing. They were coming through. He sent a coded report up the chain. 2 American destroyers approaching, ignoring warnings, preparing for forced transit. His request for guidance was blunt. Should he unleash everything? The answer came back just as blunt. Stop them. Use every asset. Send the fast boats. Fire the missiles. Launch the drones. The strait must stay closed. The order was not about tactical finesse. It was about making an example. If Iran let these 2 ships through unchallenged, the entire closure would be exposed as a bluff. Within minutes, the plan he'd spent years refining snapped into place. 14 high-speed attack boats were prepared for launch. Small, fast vessels built to sprint across the water at extreme speeds and hit from multiple angles. They weren't designed to trade shots in a traditional naval duel. They were swarm weapons. Their crews were trained to race in, fire in volume, and overwhelm defenses that were never meant to track that many threats at once. Each boat carried rockets, heavy machine guns, and the kinds of improvised weapons that had turned up in IRGC training footage for years. Behind them, along the coast, missile crews armed their launchers. Cruise missiles that had been designed specifically to kill ships at sea were aligned on coastal radars, ready to fly low over the water and punch into a destroyer's hull. Overhead, technicians prepared kamikaze drones, packing them with explosives and programming them to dive on radar signatures once the fight began. Back at sea, the 2 destroyers crossed an invisible line as they entered the western mouth of the Strait of Hormuz. To the north, the Iranian coastline was close enough that sailors could pick out buildings through binoculars. To the south, the Omani shore traced a darker line against the afternoon haze. The channel itself was unforgiving. A narrow corridor where large ships had to stay within designated traffic lanes to avoid shallow areas and collisions, with little room to maneuver. Both bridges shifted fully into combat mode. The order went through the ship, battle stations, weapon systems came online, radar operators scanned for surface contacts and incoming missiles, communications specialists monitored every frequency for threats and warnings. Marines moved to key positions, checking machine guns, grenade launchers, and ammunition belts. For 30 minutes, the only sound was the hum of machinery, the distant thrum of engines, and the quiet chatter of radios. The strait, usually packed with merchant traffic, was eerily empty. No tankers, no bulk carriers, no container ships, just 2 gray silhouettes moving through hostile water. Then the silence broke. On the lead destroyer, a radar operator called out a new contact. Multiple small craft, bearing just off the bow, closing fast. A quick range check put them at around 10,000 yards, moving in tight formation. The count came next, 14. The bridge didn't need to be told what they were. They'd seen the IRGC's fast attack doctrine briefed for years. Now they were seeing it in real time. The captain didn't wait for them to get closer before locking in his plan. General quarters had already been set, but now he gave the order that shifted everything from tense anticipation into active combat. Weapons free. Any vessel that closed aggressively, ignored warnings, or showed hostile intent would be treated as a target. The 14 boats kept coming, splitting into elements, trying to approach from different bearings to complicate the destroyer's firing solutions. The range wound down, 10,000 yards, 8,000, 6. At 4,000 yards, observers could see rockets on the decks, crews at the guns, wakes flaring white behind each bow. The first shot came from the big gun mounted on the forward deck of the lead ship, a 5-inch naval cannon built to hammer targets miles away with pinpoint fire. The turret swung, locked, and fired. The shell crossed the distance in seconds and slammed into the lead boat. For an instant, there was just a flash, then a plume of fire and debris marked where a vessel had been. Another shell followed, then another. Each time the recoil shook the deck, another boat erupted into chaos. On the second destroyer, the captain wasn't interested in letting the fast craft get any closer either. He brought his own gun into play and prepared his last-ditch defenses for what was coming next. Then the close-in weapon systems joined the fight. These were the ship's final shield, radar-guided guns designed to throw a storm of metal at anything that got dangerously close, originally meant for incoming missiles that skimmed low across the sea. Now they turned toward the swarm, Their barrels spun up with a high-pitched whine, then a deafening roar as they unleashed thousands of rounds per minute. In the view from the bridge, it looked like streams of white tracers reaching out and erasing boats from the water. Wooden and fiberglass hulls were never meant to withstand that kind of firepower. Some craft took hits amidships and broke apart almost instantly. Others burst into flames as their fuel ignited. Within seconds, several of the 14 were gone, ripped apart by a weapon system never designed with small boats in mind, but brutally effective against them. Still, not every attacker went down in the first volley. A handful of boats pushed through the fire, closing the distance and firing their own rockets and machine guns. Splashes erupted near the destroyers as rounds struck the water. One rocket detonated close enough to throw a wall of spray against the side of the lead ship. That was the point where the Marines stepped forward. Along the rails and at prepared positions, teams opened up with their own weapons. Belt-fed machine guns pouring steady streams of rounds, grenade launchers sending explosive arcs across the water, and designated marksmen targeting crew members trying to fire from the decks. The effect was brutal and efficient. Years of training kicked in as Marines worked in pairs, one spotting, one firing, adjusting for the movement of the boats and the roll of their own ship. Targets that had survived the big guns and the automated defenses now ran into a curtain of small arms fire they couldn't dodge. Boat after boat lost speed, veered off course, or vanished under plumes of smoke and water. Within minutes, the initial wave that had been meant to overwhelm the destroyers was broken. 14 boats had surged out, confident in their doctrine of swarming. None of them were still fighting, but the fast boats were only the first layer of the trap. As the last pieces of wreckage slipped under the surface, radar operators called out new contacts. Inbound missiles, low over the water, launched from coastal batteries. These weapons were built for one job: slice in under radar, pop up at close range, and slam into the hull of a ship at high speed. The destroyers didn't hesitate. Their crews had drilled these scenarios endlessly. The Aegis combat system, the brain that coordinates their sensors and weapons, calculated trajectories and launched interceptors. Standard missiles leapt from vertical launch cells, arcing into the sky before diving down to meet the incoming threats head-on. The countdowns were short and merciless. Minutes became seconds as the two sides' weapons raced toward each other. In the Combat Information Center, screens tracked both sets of icons, inbound threats and outbound interceptors, converging over the water. Then the reports started coming in. One missile destroyed mid-flight. Another, then another. All of the shore-launched weapons meant to finish what the fast boats had started were taken out before they could reach lethal range. There was no time to celebrate. As the smoke trails faded, another layer of the Iranian plan emerged. Drones. Small, fast, and packed with explosives, they appeared on radar and optical sensors at multiple bearings, flying in at low to medium altitude. This was Iran's last attempt to saturate the destroyer's defenses, using numbers and angles instead of sheer firepower. Once again, the close-in weapon systems spun up. The guns pivoted skyward, tracking the incoming drones, and opened fire. What had just shredded boats at sea level now chewed through targets in the air. Tracers lit up the sky as the destroyers threw out so much fire that anything cutting through their engagement envelope had almost no chance of surviving. In seconds that felt much longer to everyone on those ships, the drones started dropping one by one, turning into falling chunks of metal and smoke that splashed into the water harmlessly. By the time the last drone went down, the timeline was still under an hour from when the destroyers had begun their transit of the strait. The worst of the danger zone was already behind them. They had pushed through the narrowest part of the channel, beaten off a massed boat attack, survived a missile barrage, and dismantled a drone assault that was supposed to catch them overloaded and out of options. Behind them, the shoreline where Iran's coastal installations had supported the blockade was no longer untouched. Pre-planned strikes had targeted those sites as soon as the engagement escalated, and by the time the guns on the destroyers fell silent, 9 of those bases were no longer operational. Out in open water on the far side, the sea felt different. The Gulf of Oman offered more maneuvering room, more depth, and more psychological distance from the kill box they'd just passed through. The crews were still on edge, but the immediate threat had broken. That was when the radio message went out, a simple statement that would be replayed and dissected worldwide. The strait, the captain reported, was open for business. Any ship that wanted to transit could do so. Whatever control Iran had claimed over that choke point, he implied, had just been shattered. His counterpart followed up with a blunt tally: multiple attacking boats neutralized, incoming missiles intercepted, drones downed, no American casualties, no serious damage reported. The message raced up the chain of command and across the globe. In Washington, defense officials confirmed the operation's success to policymakers who had been watching the situation with the full awareness that failure would carry enormous political costs. In Gulf capitals, the news hit almost immediately. Saudi Arabia, whose economy depends heavily on stable oil exports through the strait, publicly thanked the U.S. Navy for restoring the flow of energy that underpins not just regional budgets, but global markets. The United Arab Emirates echoed that sentiment, stressing that freedom of navigation in these waters was not a luxury, it was a necessity for every nation tied into global trade. From Asia, the response carried the same tone of relief. Japan, which imports a significant share of its crude from Gulf producers, noted that disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz posed direct threats to its economic stability. India, another major buyer whose refineries depend on oil passing through that narrow corridor, welcomed the reopening of the route and the stabilization of supply. In Brussels, European officials pointed out that the closure had violated the norms that keep global trade flowing and signaled their support for operations that re-established the principle that vital choke points can't be held hostage indefinitely. Oil markets reacted almost instantly. Prices that had spiked on fears of sustained disruption began to fall as traders recalculated the risk, factoring in not only the restored flow but the clear demonstration that the US was willing to fight rather than accept a prolonged shutdown. Inside Iran, the mood was very different. The Revolutionary Guard had gambled everything on the belief that closing the Strait of Hormuz would give them untouchable leverage. Their entire strategy rested on a simple assumption: that the United States would hesitate to challenge a declared closure of such a critical waterway, especially when global markets, allied governments, and domestic politics were already under strain. Instead, 2 ships had gone in, fought through every layer of their defense, and sailed out in one piece. The fast boats that had been showcased as symbols of Iran's asymmetric naval power were gone. The bases that had taken years to fortify along the coast now existed mostly as charred remains. The material losses were huge, hundreds of millions of dollars in vessels and infrastructure, years of training and doctrine development wiped out in less than an hour. But the psychological damage cut even deeper. Iran had stepped onto the global stage and said, "We control this water." The response had been a very public refutation of that claim. Military analysts around the world began asking hard questions about how much real deterrence Tehran had left when it came to closing the strait in the future. If this was the outcome when they tried to use their naval forces as leverage,